So they have this idea that the ultimate kind of thing that stops or justifies incursion to free speech is the nation. And I'm wondering if you think there's a concept in revolutionary left-wing thought that can fulfill this same function of being that thing that stops the buck. And so I wonder if maybe the question of free speech is just kind of like a reflection of a deeper question about freedom in a more totally transformatory way.
It is. Look, I really like where you're going. I think, though, maybe you're going beyond where I actually get to in the book, if that's all right.
Sure.
But if I try and break that down a bit, look, firstly, just in terms of fascists and freedom of expression, one of the reasons why I'm making that point is I'm making it in quite a very short-term and ungeneralized sort of way. I'm just noticing something which, to a historian, is incredibly striking, which is that if you're used to the far right in 2021 and the way it talks, and then you read backwards to the far right in the 1930s, they don't use appeals to free speech. Or to be precise, they do, but in an incredibly thin, flat, casual way. So that, this is an argument I have with, friends who write about the histories of the 1930s. Mosley talked about free speech once in passing in 1934. That proves had theory of free speech. No, it doesn't. What it actually shows is that he had available to him this ideological weapon, which the far right today would have used, and they used repeatedly and made central to their thinking. And he doesn't, because he can't imagine it as something that could be any significant use to him. So it's one of the ways actually we have a better sense of the past. It's not that today it's 100 of something and then it was 0 something. It's today it's 90 of something and then it was 10 of something. So I'm just what I'm trying to do there is historicize not just the past, but really the present. Trying to say that this moment that we're in is a really weird and striking, strange moment in terms of history of the far right in Europe over the last 100 years, and for people to get that, it's not always been like this. In terms of the notion of freedom you're talking about, which is the positive notion of freedom, definitely in my book there is an idea that we have to have an idea of generalized freedom, including freedom in the context of speech, which is broader and more generous than liberal rights will ever get us to. And I think your reference to the nation is suggestive. I'd be lying if I said I picked that up in the book. One of the places I think I do pick it up in the book is when I get into the last few pages, when I start trying to talk to some extent about what a communist of any variety notion of free speech worthy of descriptions of communist theory of free speech would look like. And I just make points which you don't hear enough on the left about. Our notion of free speech it's not about an individual, like for Donald Trump. His notion of free speech occurs when a rich person is given a loud megaphone and everyone else has to sit there mutely and listen to them. At the very least, our notion of free speech must, at the very least, envisage exchanges, dialogues. It must envisage the rights of hecklers, of people to disagree. But again, our notion of free speech must imagine that there are vast numbers of people who'd actually like to have audiences, and audiences, not audiences on command, but opportunities to create audiences far more than people have today. People would like the idea that their speech might be relevant, they might be heard, they might be part of a democratic discussion which might change how resources are allocated, how their working lives, how their rest lives are run. So our notion of speech is busy and it's peopled and it's loud and it's polyvocal. And in all those ways, it's different from the liberal notion of free speech. Now, again, then I'm only really talking about particular. I totally get, I think, behind your question is an idea that the liberal notions of rights are always notions of the individual in a negative relationship to the state. So they imagine, well, you basically got this person, you think about, Marx talks about this on the Jewish question. There are lots of anarchists who talk about this is the big thing. In some of the eco-anarchists I read from the 1960s and 70s in the States. What they both have is a notion that in liberal rights, the ultimate right of the individual is this selfish individual who basically wants to set up a factory and then be left alone and not required to pay taxes. And then because they've got their factory and they've been left alone, they've got a bit of money. Now they want to own a newspaper and they want to be left alone. They don't want to have any obligations upon themselves. And now in relation to those, I think continuously different left traditions, different interesting left traditions want rights to be positive, affirmatory, creative things. And maybe we need a word, I think there's something I've made a point of before on one of these podcasts, we need a word beyond rights. Rights itself is part of the problem, but envisages that sense of freedom, which is much deeper, which is much wilder, which is much more chaotic, which et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So just rights, including the right to speak, is a bad place to be and a bad place to end. It's not necessarily a bad place to begin, just so long as you go really fast away from it and don't stop there and go to something much more interesting quite quickly. But again, the difficult thing is these are things I kind of leave very vague and hinted at in the book. You know, there are other things I want to write which might go into this in more detail. But in the book, it really is on the train of free speech rights for us, for them. Why do we take them away, etc. It's not this sort of bold total conception of human liberation, which, you know, I'm quite committed to.
Sure. I mean, that is why I'm asking you about it. For this exact reason that it is left kind of like it's the kind of horizon which the book is seemingly kind of oriented towards, but doesn't quite kind of get its full expression. You use the term, and I don't want to be the kind of podcast that just like says the word neoliberalism, but I'm going to do it anyway. So, you know, content note for the next 5 seconds. In neoliberalism, it seems like there is quite a big transformation of the way in which this kind of contestability of the state changes. Maybe you kind of disagree with that, but it seems like the period that you're talking about with this development of the no platform idea, the 70s, is the end of a post-war period in which democratic contestation at quite like I don't mean low level as in there's less of it, but at the level of individuals getting together and doing things, still has some ability to change how the state functions. And we've seen over the last, say, 40 years, that ability for groups of people to contest the fundamental liberal arrangement of economics and so on, allocation of resources, as you put it, we've seen that ability wane. So in that period, it seems like the state can take a position very much in favor of free speech, because in some ways the state becomes more unassailable in the neoliberal period than it has ever been before. Something quite odd happens with the arrival of the internet, which is that mass associationism and forms of collective action suddenly become much more viable again, but in a totally different and totally kind of new ways. And I was wondering if you think that broader history of the relationship between the state, mass association, politics as a mass phenomena, both on the left, both on the right, which is existing in the post-war period, wanes during neoliberalism, and then is suddenly but strangely returning in the period of the internet. I wonder if you think this has any kind of bearing on how we understand or how we should understand free speech.
Okay. I think there's loads there that you're asking, and I'll try and be I'll try and get it. But again, I'm going to start from what's in the book and then maybe go beyond it. What's in the book is an idea that the centre right shifts towards a position of free speech, kind of prior to the neoliberal period, because they have to. And then during the neoliberal period, towards a position that's much more actively in favour of free speech and seeing it as a kind of partisan signifier. Now, what is it about neoliberalism which enables the centre-right and the far-right together to make that shift towards being in favour of free speech? I don't think it's what you said about neoliberalism, which is that neoliberalism is a project which takes away people's abilities to change the state. I think that's to misunderstand what neoliberalism does. What neoliberalism does is I read neoliberalism, and again, this is somewhere outside the book. I'm bringing in future writing projects to help answer this question, but I think you have to. Is that neoliberalism distinguishes radically between social and economic rights, which are to be diminished, and political and democratic rights, which are to be increased. So what's actually happened, which is really weird and is ongoing, is that we've got neoliberal parties which create this constant panoply of new rights. the quantity of the law continuously expands under neoliberalism. We get the creation of new rights of people the whole time, but often the rights they can enforce are quite weak and thin and useless rights. They're not the rights which people would want to have. They're not the right to be housed. They're not the right to a decent living standard without having to do any work. They're the rights of, for example, under Margaret Thatcher in the mid-1980s, you get the first attempt to create free speech rights in universities for people who are putting on far-right political events. So you get the creation of rights, and you get more rights of individuals in relation to the state, except they're these very strange kind of useless rights, often rights which people never enforce. So we've got in Britain the higher education bill, which is coming in this year. One of the reasons why they've had to bring it in is they've had this free speech right in universities. I think Section 43 of the Education Act 1985, off the top of my head. I may have got that wrong, but it's something like that. And in 35 years since Thatcher introduced it, there've been like no cases about it. So she created this almost phantom right, which didn't even help the people it was supposed to help. So to crank the history forward a bit, I think what's going on, and I think you can see it in the HE bill today, is this attempt constantly to deepen the neoliberal revolution. And if that can be done by giving people individual rights to defeat collective projects or to defeat collective assets, that's okay. So it's not the case that the individual is made powerless in relation to the state. It's the individual is made powerful in relation to the state if they're the selfish individual who's defeating collective political projects. Now, that's why we've got the higher education bill, which is coming in, and the clauses in it, which should essentially enable anyone to sue a university anywhere because any infringement of free speech or academic freedom has been made. It's the sort of thing which sounds good when you hear it the first time until you realise how it's going to be used, which is by right-wing think tanks with lots and lots of money funding pretty desperado type individuals who've got no real social base, kind of bludgeoning the universities and compelling them to take these people and treat them like they're authorities. If they've had one column in the Daily Telegraph, then they're as senior and as relevant as your professor who's been there 30 years knows about something. So it's not that rights are weak. It's not that rights are antithetical to the state. The state and the right, it's the right wing starting to use rights as a way of reforming politics on their terrain. Now, then we get on to the really interesting thing, if you don't mind, in your question for me, which was how does the internet and the mass intrusion of politics, how does it destabilize this? Because it does in all sorts of ways. I mean, you can see, for example, under Trump, this absolute fury that individual blocks of capital have been able to form these really, really important mass platforms over which actually the state's got almost no authority or control at all. And they had this desperate desire to be able to police this on his terms, but in essence, he couldn't police it on these terms because it's been set up in an epoch of neoliberal capitalism. So legally, how do we think about it? Certainly, how do American lawyers think about it? They go, we have free speech. Free speech is absolute. It's a constitutional value. It's the most important thing in our legal system, except if the free speech you're asking for is free speech on the side of something that's controlled by a private individual, a company, whereupon there are no free speech rights at all. So it's kind of weird that the private states acting in the epoch of neoliberal, private corporations acting under an epoch of neoliberal advance, be able to kind of carve themselves entirely out of the legal sphere and get themselves entitled to say, they set the rules. And because, in an epoch of neoliberalism, you still get political opposition, that leads to things like the Black Lives Matter. It leads to millions of people making demands. We don't want these right-wing or far-right hate speakers on Twitter, on Facebook, etc. And actually having quite a lot of success with that. So you have this kind of really counterintuitive situation where neoliberalism says smash the state, not really smash the state, but smash the collective, hand everything over to the corporations. That will mean that all our people get to speak and all the other people don't get to speak. And suddenly these corporations, weirdly, under some pressure from mass movement, are suddenly they're the woke corporations. Obviously, they're not the woke corporations, but taking away platforms from Donald Trump. So you get that rule that opposition will always assert itself, the desire of the people, given opportunity, will express itself. This ends up shaping itself in ways which, if you kind of thought about this from the point of view of politics in the 1970s, and as someone old enough to have lived through the 1970s and still have a bit of that in my bones, there is no way that anyone could have or would have conceived the actual battle lines we're faced with now compared to what we thought they were 30 or 40 years ago.
One of the kind of the oddest features of this, the kind of woke capital kind of ideas, is you get Tucker Carlson on Fox News with this kind of panoply of left-wing companies. That's the kind of the caption he gives to them. It's like Twitter is a left-wing company, Facebook's a left-wing company, these kind of things. I don't know.
Coca-Cola is a left-wing company.
Yeah.
What?
but then there's a lesson to us, which is don't then just mirror back and say, oh, Coca-Cola genuinely is ours. Don't say that Amazon genuinely is ours. Don't say that, because if you look at, I think there's one point in the book when I talk about what are the 5 highest capitalized companies in the United States right now, and it really is Microsoft, it's Amazon, it's Facebook, it's all these absolute rogues. And the point is, these are the companies who are responsible for this moment in world capitalism, where they are the rich, and they're the people who aren't paying taxes, and they're the people who are burning the planet. And unless you want that part of your politics to absolutely disappear, you cannot accept the idea that just because, I don't know, just because Facebook took away Donald Trump's page, suspended him for a year, that is a left-wing company. We're not going to let our notions of the left be narrowed down to that point. That would be a disaster. And I wouldn't be saying that if I didn't think there are some people on the left who kind of falling into that trap. That we don't talk enough about the hideous undemocratic structures of these organizations. We don't talk enough about their constant horrible plans for speech, let alone for anything else.
You talk about in the book about free speech in the contemporary moment becoming a kind of, I suppose, I can't remember the exact phrase, but a kind of ideological object on the right, rather than something that's sincerely fought for. And we can see this in like the kind of, for example, this AP journalist Emily Wilder, who was fired for her pro-Palestine activism in college, and you give some examples in the book as well. And there is a danger of getting caught in a fundamentally insincere kind of debate with the right on this. How can we be debating free speech with people who don't actually mean it at all? And I wondered how we you spoke a little bit about this already with the work corporation stuff, but how do we get beyond this kind of worky, the Spectator's doing this worky leaks column. There's this ongoing churning culture war, which seems to do everything in its power to distract from the fact that the right are in ascendancy in most, all over the world and things like this. How do we break through that, I think, very distracting melange of stuff?
Well, I think one of the things that we can do is actually by continuing to use the word free speech, by refusing to let them go, we're in favour of free speech. We actually say, no, you are not in favour of free speech. You are calling for left-wing academics to get sacked because they won't hold your party line, that the British Empire is amazing. And I think if we do that, and if we do that with a degree of consistency, we can both let certain groups of people that we want to speak be enabled to speak, and we can beat back attempts by the far right to remove our speaking platforms, because we can actually be more consistent than them. I'm not saying that overall the culture wars, that's necessarily the same approach. And I really don't have a general always in the culture wars do X type approach. I think you have to see them a bit more independently than that. But on this, we say, look, if some government minister is in favour of Noah Carl being able to speak at Cambridge University, that's not free speech. That's someone from the centre right supporting someone from the far right who's relatively close to him politically. If you want to get some awards for being in favour of free speech, now tell me about what left-wing causes, what speaking rights of which left-wing causes you're speaking up for. You don't get to be free speech unless you're speaking up for the rights of some people you disagree with.
There was an excellent example of this a few months ago on the radio, where a very canny BBC presenter presented the government minister with so you think Holocaust deniers should have free speech under your bill? And the government was less scrambling and contradictory kind of way about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, the last newspaper article I wrote was for the Jewish Chronicle. The Jewish Chronicle, I'm sure every reader will remember how during Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, the Jewish Chronicle was its biggest antagonist. And, constantly broke stories critical of him or people in the party. I'm not suggesting the Jewish Chronicle, under its present editor, Stephen Pollard, who writes for a bunch of right-wing papers, has invited Nigel Farage, given platforms to him, and made excuses for all sorts of people who said all sorts of terrible anti-Semitic things on the right, is any sort of person you could work with on any sort of basis. But the reason why, in order to try and embarrass the government a bit about the university's bill, I wrote an article for the Jewish Chronicle, because I knew very well that this was a part of the right's base. They see the Jewish Chronicle as an ally. They don't want to be embarrassed by them. They find it very difficult to respond to an argument saying, look, your HE bill, amongst its many problems, it's not just that it's going to mean that every Holocaust denier gets to speak. It also means that every anti-Semite gets to speak. It also means that if you're just like some Jewish group that's putting on some event on the Sabbath and you want to have a room to do it, now under the wording of the university's bill, that says clearly as possible, you are not entitled to exclude people on the basis of their opinion. Well, I don't want anti-Semites in my band. I don't want someone who thinks David Irving's great to come along to my Sabbath when we're all just hanging out as Jewish people. Well, sorry, the bill says you're not allowed to do that anymore. So it's trying to work away at those contradictions and kind of embarrass the government and force the government to be saying two completely opposite things at the same time. And to my mind, you're not doing this in the hope of winning the government. You're not hoping to make them. All you're trying to do is is in every point of politics. There's always a bunch of people watching. Some who go in one way, some who go another. And if they see those ministers saying things which are just obviously garbage and are obviously unbelievable, that strikes a chord with them. So that's my idea of how the sharp bits of the left should be operating in this moment, is trying to really force those contradictions wide open to the point where no one can miss them anymore.
This idea of having a particular kind of audience for whom there is a certain kind of performance happening is, I think, a really kind of important one and a useful one for anti-fascism, given that how kind of often secretive or kind of even private it tries to make its actions. I think for some anti-fascists, it would seem just as useful to have a sort of, to defeat the fascists in a kind of a physical way, completely in private with no one else watching, as it would be if that happened kind of in the center of London or something like that. And in the history section, you make a really interesting kind of like analysis of the relationship between Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League. And I wonder if you could kind of spell out what it is that you see, not just in the kind of you don't say, okay, this one's better than this one, but there's a much more nuanced approach to the strategy that both of them were pursuing together and the relationship between them. I was wondering if you could just kind of spell out how that worked and maybe what it kind of hints at for anti-fascists today.
Okay, look, I will do that about the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism, but if it's right, can I just do a little bit of a seg to it first? And it goes like this. Look, in terms of anti-fascism, I've noticed that sort of one little bit of criticism I have been getting up online is from groups associated with particularly militant anti-fascism who feel that my book doesn't do enough for them. And I am going to talk about Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League, but I really want to signal before I get to that, I don't only take account of the bits of anti-fascist history which are closest to me ideologically, and there's nothing in my book which criticizes militant anti-fascism. In fact, there's 3 pages which talk about AFA and actually celebrate the way that AFA and Red Action played in the 1980s in terms of physical confrontations with fascists when it felt like the rest of the left had just gone home and kind of left the issue for whatever reason. So this is not a book which says mass is better than militant or liberal is better than mass, or it really does. What I do say, however, is that the stakes of that particular argument, militant, mass, liberal, are higher when quite a lot of the people we might want to confront in terms of our anti-fascism don't look to that watching crowd like they're fascists at all. That suddenly means that the stakes of you need to get this right. Whatever tactic you're going to do it right, and you really need to get it right, because at different points in the past, it was absolutely obvious to most people watching that the fascists were fascists. If you're 1946 in Britain, it's really, really obvious that Oswald Mosley is a fascist. No one is having a debate about whether the union movement are actually fascists anymore. But if some of the things that we're trying to confront today call themselves non-fascists, celebrate the role played in the Second World War by Churchill, are electoral rather than trying to smash the state. Actually, getting it right is really, really, really important, and it's harder than it used to be. And this is not an argument for militant, this is not an argument against militant, it's not an argument for mass or for liberal. It's just an argument. Whatever anti-fascism you do, please do it really, really well. Because it's harder than it used to be. Right now,
can I just come in? So this is also in the context of increasing this moment in which there's a real push on the right, centre right, most of the right, to make Antifa the real fascists. And anti-fascists are the ones who are infringing on the rights of these, people, right? These activists who are for this thing. And we've seen it particularly in the case of Andy Ngo and his career. But this is a refrain across the right and across countries.
Yeah, it's part of Trump. It's a major part of Trump's election message. And if we had an electoral right that was that where it was under as much challenge as Trump was under, they would be doing the same arguments here. It's not particularly an argument at Britain at the moment, but there's nothing that will stop it from being an argument in 2 or 3 or 4 years' time. So we need to get it right. Okay, now, come on specifically to 70s and specifically kind of a bit like, for me, home territory in terms of the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism and what they represented, the things I've written about before. I just make the point that that I don't think anyone who's looked back at that period from our vantage points ever particularly emphasised before, which is that if you look at the Anti-Nazi League and if you look against Rock Against Racism, they actually had 2 completely different notions to how you deal with fascist speaking. In terms of the Anti-Nazi League, their approach was to say there are fascists, if there might be fascists, for example, who are members of the National Front or the British Movement, but have also got a day job in the local council. I'm thinking of a particular council called Jones, I think, in Manchester. And said, look, when you've got people like that who are organising, our role is to deny them any speaking opportunity at all. So, for example, if someone's employed by a local council, we go off and try and get that individual sacked. So with the Anti-Nazi League, the emphasis was all about taking away the platforms of fascist speech. And if you look against Rock Against Racism, although it was sort of set up in opposition to racist speeches and acts by significant musicians, David Bowie, Eric Clapton, and although it tried to make life hell for them, its basic approach towards speech wasn't to try and take away anyone's platform. Just, well, other people can do that. Some of this is just a division of labour within a mass movement. You do that, happy to you doing it, we're going to do something else. And what they tried to do is they actually tried to, as it were, turn up the megaphone and increase the speech of the left. And increase the speech of the left by taking things which might otherwise be quite ordinary, conventional political speech, newspapers, leaflets, flyers, words, and tried to say we're going to have speech taken from music, we're going to have music and we're going to have art, we're going to express left-wing politics in this enormously range of different ways. There were quite often fascists who were like NF supporters who were half round a local Rock Against Racism group, half round a bunch of local Nazis. And one of the things which you come across again and again in the experience of Rock Against Racism is these kind of young, white, the people are chosen because they're winnable. This isn't a tactic for everyone. This is a tactic for the kind of the weak exterior of the far right. They're invited into left-wing places. They listen to music. The music's all done by black artists. They're surrounded by left-wing people talking and arguing with them. And they're allowed to speak. But they're allowed to speak in a situation which is intended to be a sort of counter-recruitment exercise where they're recruited out of the far right, where being allowed to speak but then being answered becomes the things which pulls them. Now, I'm really, really, really not saying Rock Against Racism is the answer for all time. It's kind of rare that anti-fascist politics hits this absolute sweet spot of like cultural perfection, where you've got a mass cultural phenomenon already happening outside you, which is open to anti-fascist politics, but which is also like the most happening thing in culture in that country at that time for a whole generation of young people. That's not something you can recreate by an effort of will. But I'm saying it's just interesting that they had such a different approach to speech. And that I think some of that maneuver, some of that notion of increasing our speaking might be a sensible tactic for people dealing with clearly non-fascist antagonists in politics today, that actually had a bit more spirit of Rock Against Racism would help certain movements certain social and political movements which have focused very much on the idea of we have opponents, they're hateful to us, please don't let them speak, please judge, please university administrator, take away their speaking rights. A bit more of a spirit of everyone else is going to come behind you and amplify you, make sure your voices are heard everywhere, might actually get them better results.
I think the closest example to this in the 2010s was probably grime in the UK, right? But like the thing is, they just it wasn't very good at converting people. Like no one in the EDL was like kind of persuaded by grime that they should stop being racists. But I think what you're saying about levels of conviction is very important, or like what you kind of implied about levels of conviction. It seems like organizations like the DFLA and the EDL, probably less so the EDL, more the DFLA, were composed broadly of people who had one particular grievance, and who had very little other coherent politics at all. And if that grievance could be like understood or kind of expressed in certain ways, would probably not have subscribed to the kind of package of far right ideals that the rest of the DFLA or the kind of the harder elements within the DFLA subscribe to. I mean, that's not to kind of ignore the fact that there were, real genuine neo-Nazis inside the DFLA. That was a real thing. But nevertheless, there was that was a small kind of hardcore, and then there was a much more kind of fuzzy collection of people around there. And so I wonder, what should our relationship be to this kind of mass movement? Does that...
So what you're saying, so which kind of mass movement are you talking about now? You're talking about the DFLA type movement?
We're talking about DFLA or like an EDL type movement. Like how... So it doesn't seem to me that there are cultural handles that you can get on the EDL. There doesn't seem to me to be cultural handles that could be in common in the same way that Rock Against Racism was, right? So we kind of struggled with this in our in the conclusion to the book we wrote recently, the post-internet far right one, which was because it wasn't really clear what the common cultural vocabulary could even be that could allow this kind of cultural project of anti-fascism to take place. And maybe, I mean, that's just kind of a question that is unanswerable because culture has fractured in the last kind of 40, 50 years. But like, how do you see this kind of the stakes of this now?
Okay, in terms of the DFLA, I thought one of the things that was really interesting was how groups like Football Lads and Lasses Against Fascism tried to relate to them, because they thought they had a common cultural space, which was football, actually. So they tried to reinvigorate left-wing, and they have tried to invigorate left-wing spaces around football as the place where you can win an argument. I think that's happening. I think in some places it's successful, and I don't think that's a bad approach. I have to say, I kind of trusted a bit more than what you're saying, if you don't mind, because you made it sound like people would join DFLA whatsoever because there was an initial grievance which was pulling them in. And then therefore, because it was one thing, therefore their commitment to it was relatively soft. I have to say that's not quite how I read the DFLA, that all the EDL which preceded it, I think that what brought them in wasn't a grievance. It's not like the 60s and 70s where people came into far right groups had a grievance about immigration. And then people generalized from immigration to other stuff. So you'd go from the specific to the general. I think often what brought people into those groups was this general sense that was really quite diffuse and diverse, that Britain was going down the pan. This was the fault of Muslims. And this had lots and lots of different expressions, including they weren't entitled to have their English flags up, etc., etc., etc. And I don't think that it was a case to just knock out that one route in and you defeat them. And I think you can kind of see that as well in the way in which that style of organising has hung around. It's hung around because it's been a way in which you can actually express certain things about, for example, about class. It's not comfortable for the left to think one of our antagonists, one of the reasons why they're able to recruit several different generations of supporters is because that antagonist has actually been talking to people often in smaller towns, often quite depressed areas, about class. We haven't been talking to the people, but I think that's a lot of what's been going on. So I think Fluff went in the right way, and I think they used culture in the right way, but it's just that's the sort of battle which takes quite a lot of time to win. In terms of more broadly, grime wasn't going to defeat the DFLA, but it's had its cultural moment. It had its cultural moment with Corbynism, where suddenly it seemed to be converting just lots of young voters into Labour voters. And again, one of the things I'm trying to get to see is that the anti-fascist politics in the present day isn't necessarily about small groups of people chasing after another small group of people. It's not about 20 members of this particular, I don't know, whatever far right cell. We're actually in a moment where, because the centre right has relationship with the far right, sometimes you need anti-fascists to have a vocabulary and have an ambition talking about mass politics, which is affecting millions, because the centre right's relationship with the far right is having an impact on a far broader scale than we realise. And we need to be trying to resist that too. And then finally, in essence, is there like a general medium of cultural intervention that could play an analogous role to music in the 70s today? And I think if there is, it's probably internet culture. That's probably the thing which more people spend their time on. And again, if you historicise music, and one of the reasons why I'm historicising music is because I'm 48 years old. I don't know what music people listen to now. Really, I'm too fucking old. So all I can do is look back at things which happened before and try and historicise them in relationship to the present. But the reality is that when there's certain albums which came out in 1968 or 1978, and when they came out, 15 million young people in Britain rushed off and bought them. Now, if there's anything, it seems to me, which has the same sort of generalising, experience
the
today,
Doge meme.
It is. Or it's Cats. I mean, I'm sorry, or it's even from them, it's the success they've had of Bloody Pepe the Frog. So it's got to, we should have the notion that the anti-fascists should be in a relationship with internet mass cultural producers, and those internet mass cultural producers should be people who are capable of talking to millions. And if you're a leftist and you're trying to change how people think, and the limit of your ambitions is, can I get an opinion piece in The Guardian? He says, holding his hand up for guilty at this point. You're settling for a pretty small audience compared to some of the audience which, some parts of the left have been able to win, sometimes quite a temporary way, but have been able to win at times in the last 5 and 10 years.
I think of one example of one example of this. It was the statue defender protest and the counter protest last year, 2020, in which, after there was this big street statue defender mobilization that was called quite organically on the right and in the same circles of the DFLA, we had kind of a withdrawal of officially constituted anti-fascist groups and like official BLM groups that were organizing as well. And instead, you just had this wave of self-organized almost, or like kind of unofficially organized young black people and young people in general come out and stand up to these people in central London. So there is
for me, it's not even that. It's Colston. Colston is a mass cultural moment. It's the pulling down that statue. How many people in Britain, how many people around the world saw that statue go into the water? Isn't that the sort of thing we're trying to have a relationship with? It's not wave 2, wave 3 of that process. It's wave 1. It's that statue coming down. That was our moment. And I'm quite sure there were anti-fascists in that crowd. But I'm also sure that they weren't the only people in the crowd. There were a lot of different people in that crowd. But it's kind of, how do you create those sorts of moments which then have an impact on people's consciousness, and then potentially shape all of our collective idea of what's possible.
Well, I mean, actually, that's really true. When once that statue went in the water, it was done. Like, it wasn't going to get put up and get restored, and it went to a museum where it belonged a long time ago. And those irreversible moments, I think, that's really interesting, actually.
I think maybe I'm going to say something kind of pessimistic from the vantage point of anti-fascism, but like quite optimistic from the point of like anti-racism, which is I see anti-fascism but anti-fascism is like a very specialized form of a broader anti-racist movement. And in some ways, this is what makes me uneasy about your book, because it's in some ways a fairly, and you make an argument at the end of the book in the conclusion about specifically the popularity of the argument that you're making. So you say that people will understand, or if the targets are well chosen, people have a kind of natural inclination towards the prohibitions on the speech of fascists. They understand why that is necessary, and they agree with it. And this, I think, is true. But in some ways, the reason why you're writing the book is because people don't have just that inclination, right? The reason why the book is having to be written in the first place is because actually people think that lots of other speech should be silenced. And anti-fascism is a increasingly junior part of this relationship between anti-fascist and anti-racist movements. And if we're going to talk about kind of the appearance or the necessity of having a social base to back up your politics and to have a kind of mass movement that agrees with what you're doing, then I think we need look no further to our kinds of cousins or something, right, in the anti-racist movements, which are massive. I mean, like, it's not just that. So that Colson statue didn't come down in the context of like a anti-DFLA thing. It didn't come down in the context of an anti-EDL thing, right? It came down in the context of Black Lives Matter. And that's quite significant. And I think it was read as such. And this is why I find it kind of uneasy to rest the argument eventually on the idea of having a mass base, because what the mass base is telling us is participants in anti-racist movements are telling us, by and large, that there is an urgency for an expanded view of deplatforming.
Okay. Again, 2 or 3 things there. First of all, if it's right that we're in a moment when anti-fascism is and is going to be the junior partner in relation to anti-racism, personally, I have no problem with that whatsoever.
No, right. No, that's why I say it's optimistic in some ways.
No, but I want to vocalize this to the anti-fascists who listen to this. This is a good thing. This is a desirable state to be in. It comes about because actually fascism is not a significant polar at this particular moment in terms of how the right and the far right are operating. Because it's coming about because in this moment, not just A, the far right's relatively marginal, but B, people can see it's marginal. And I would much rather be in a situation where anti-fascists can say, well, we're keeping our how about a different military analogy? We are the Irish volunteers at the end of the First World War who have achieved independence for Ireland, and they've got all their guns, and they're getting their wall plaster, and they're plastering over the walls, so you can't see the guns anymore, but they're there because actually the specific anti-fascist component isn't so necessary. Now, I quite like that. I like that because it's a sign that the far right's doing badly. One anti-fascist long ago put it to me, so the thing about anti-fascism, it always gets revived just a little bit too late. We're in a moment where it isn't too late, and we're in a moment where we can sort of keep things on a much less, and that's good. And we should all think, we can allow different parts of our personality to stress. This is desirable and great. But on your other point, I think far more important point, which is the audience. Okay. Part of what I'm saying in the book, I suppose, is there's more than one audience. You're now invoking an audience, which is the very large number of anti-racists saying, look, if we can just shut up racist speech, we can stop them talking, we've won, haven't we? And I agree with you. If you read that audience, then that is what they want. The mass anti-racist audience wants racist speech to stop. And again, totally get why they do, yeah? And to go along and say, we should be discriminating within this, we should be choosing carefully, we should be selecting which racists get to speak. That racist should be continued to speak. I can get, if that was what the argument was, I can get why lots of people wouldn't want to listen to it. But the thing is, there's more than one audience. There's also another audience of people, which is the 50% of people who aren't particularly political, who don't really have strong views about anything. And the truth is that if you push the hate speech argument past a breaking point, past the point where you're winning enough of that audience, then you start losing. So there's a tactical argument against hate speech, which is that you ask the state to intervene on your side, and then lo and behold, wait a second, the state's intervening against you. And you get surprised by this. Now, one of the reasons why the state's able to intervene against you is because of the people watching. Suddenly a bunch of them thinking, this has gone too far. Now, it is really not the argument of my book that you kind of sit there as an activist going, right, have we got all of liberal public opinion assembled behind us? If we don't have all of liberal public opinion assembled behind us, we can do nothing. But it isn't an argument of my book that you need to, that it is still, while doing the most radical things possible in any moment, it is still also actually desirable to have public opinion behind you. That you shouldn't use this as a break or as an excuse for inaction, but it's just good and sensible politics. And that if you've got a sense of the cultural politics of the moment, you can do really quite brave and dangerous and radical things, and people won't mind. Now, an example I've often used, and I've used with you two on podcasts before, is the punch against Richard Spencer. I really like the fact that tens of millions of people around the world identified and approved of that punch. I'm not going to say you needed to have all their support lined up in advance in order to do that punch. I'm not saying that public opinion is an excuse for inaction, but I'm saying if you're going to do that militant and radical thing anyway, it is desirable that if it connects to people's aspirations and ambitions and motivates them and gives them the energy to want to go on doing stuff themselves. Because that's a sort of ideal dynamic where the most left-wing or radical, whatever adjective you want to use, action available in a moment becomes attractive to other people and mobilizes other people. So it's desirable to have a sense of your relationship with the audience. And my point is just, to go back to that point, the point I always make is there were things going on in that moment, which meant that a whole bunch of people who weren't that left-wing were able to get that this was an anti-fascist action and therefore wanted to share it. And those things which made it feel incredibly contemporary, I've done the list before, they are the fact that it's not just a punch, that it's their speech and you can understand. The fact that Spencer comes over smirking and hideous. The fact he's he's pretending not to be a Nazi and he's so obviously pretending. All that total package makes it work. But I want a moment where, things like that connect to people's hopes and ambitions and make them become, activists and contribute to struggle too. And if your politics is, saying at the moment, if your justification was, I'm all in favour of, I'm trying to think of a sort of bad example of this. I'm all in favour of every time a minister speaks, we should call them a racist and say their speech must be taken down. I'd say in the present moment, that action sounds tremendously radical, but it's not going to connect to the mass of people. And it's not going to connect to the mass of people because people aren't going to accept that Boris Johnson is a racist in the way you're using the word racist, that a racist who is so unacceptable, they're never allowed to speak. So if that's your strategic perspective, I'm going to say to you, I think that's a bad perspective. But that doesn't mean that where I'm going to draw the line, therefore, is that I'm less of an activist or I'm less militant than you. What I'm going to say is I've got better ideas for struggle, which can involve more people in protest and can make protests more effective and more dynamic and actually bring more left wing. And it's that totality of different approach that I'm trying to convey. So it's not about bringing back anti-fascism when people don't particularly want to be anti-fascists. It's about learning the best lessons of anti-fascism and expressing them in our moment when there aren't that many people wandering around in Nazi uniforms, but the basic core ideas of the book, which are, aim big in terms of changing society, which are, we've got some enemies out there and they need to be defeated. Those all still apply, even in a context where the ideological justification, the central poles, the spearhead of the far right, isn't actually fascists.
I have lots more things I would like to come back on, but I feel like we've gone on long enough. Thank you very much, David, for coming. Go and get the book. It's out from Routledge. Yes? No Free Speech for Fascists.
It is, yeah.
Yes. It's.
I just nodded. This is, again, like we're doing a podcast. What on earth is the point of nodding on a podcast?
You can nod if you want. I mean, there'll be an audio described version. You've already done the kind of the grimacing. Wow. Yeah. Sam is looking very handsome today. Sam. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, David. And we'll see you very soon.
And listen, thanks so much for inviting me. And again, am I allowed to ask, is this like really cheeky? How long is it till your thing comes out?
2 weeks.
We thank you for reminding us to plug our content.
Oh, God. Oh, yes, that was what you were doing. Right. It's like
no. I'm not asking you to plug your content. I'm asking to tell me as a potential reader, because you two have been involved in a really exciting writing project. you have a very interesting podcast where you invite all these other people on, but actually you two write to it, and you two got something important coming out, and it's coming out relatively soon.
September the 6th.
Cool.
September the 6th.
And then the second one is, when's the second?
February 2022.
Okay, that's good.
That's not for a while.
Seriously, good luck, because I've read the one from September. I'm sure you will get to plug it later in this podcast or something after it's gone. But just, need to anyone listening, listen, it is good. I've read it. And
thanks a lot for listening. If you enjoyed that, then you can go over to Patreon, where we now have a whole bunch of more premium episodes and essays and other things like that. We're also starting a book club for people who want to get more into this stuff. You can read along with us. We'll talk about it. We'll have regular Zoom calls. It'll be great fun. And on the higher tier, we'll even send you a copy of our 2 books when they drop. That's patreon.com/12 rules for what. All the support we get means a lot to us, and it really does help us grow this project. And thanks a lot for listening again, and I'll see you very soon.
In the eyes of the government, we are the enemy.
In a world where there is no government, anarchy rules. This summer, get ready for the most action-packed podcast.
We continue fighting because we hate all authority and love freedom, which cannot be given, but must be taken.
Such scenes as, "This is not a dialogue," "A crime called freedom," "Party's over," and many, many more.
For more text and audio material of interest to anarchists,
check out resonanceaudiodistro.org.
12 rules.